Welcome back to the Mental Health Podcast, where we take politics, social issues, pop culture, and try to look at them through a mental health lens. Today, I wanted to talk about some more cognitive concepts. So we talked in previous ones about confirmation bias and hostile attribution bias, and followed that up with some talk about regulation and the hand model of the brain and how our stress levels impact our ability to think clearly. And now I want to flip back again to that kind of higher level thinking and how it's playing into a lot of different patterns I'm seeing with a number of social issues. So let me start with a little anecdote to illustrate the first concept. So let's say that you have a test coming up, all right? And you already kind of have some low confidence in terms of how this test is going to play out. Your thought is, this test is not going to go well. I'm probably going to fail this test. So if you're feeling like you're going to fail this test, what are your actions going to look like? Are you going to study for this test? Well, if you're really dead set in that thought, my guess would be probably not, or at least you're going to study less than if you had kind of higher confidence in your ability to do well. So you don't study for the test, and the test comes around, and you take it. And what happens? You fail that test. Okay, the question is, why did you fail that test? Now, if you're following my logic here, you're probably landing on the answer of, well, you didn't study for it. And why didn't you study for it? Because you felt like you were going to fail it. So thus is the self-fulfilling prophecy. You basically set out an idea in your head, an assumption of how things are going to play out, what the outcome is going to be, and as a result, you actually act in a way that causes that outcome to happen, or at least reinforces the possibility that that is the outcome that you're going to get. Another example here. Let's say you've got an adult. It could be a teacher, it could be a parent, it could be anyone. So they're looking at a young person, and you've probably heard some situations before where this person says, oh, that kid's not going to amount to anything. They're not going to do really well. They're a bad kid. I've heard many variations of this over the years. Very common. I feel like it's getting better, but in any case, you'll still hear it. And so over time, that word starts to spread, right? And oftentimes, the kid will end up hearing that. And it may be directly from that person literally telling them that you're not going to amount to anything, or it could just be through that person's general behavior. So here and again is the self-fulfilling prophecy. If you already have somebody that you live with or you're working with and you feel like they're not going to amount to anything, that's your thought, that's going to influence how you act towards that person. So the most obvious example would be thinking about a teacher. If a teacher feels like this student is not going to amount to anything, they're probably not going to invest a whole bunch of time into helping them with schoolwork and responding to their questions, making time to speak with them outside of class because, hey, they're a lost cause. So what's the point? So predictably, what ends up happening, especially if this kid is surrounded by people who feel this way? They probably end up not doing very well. And again, that begs the question, why did they not do well? Well, in large part because they didn't have the right people supporting them to do better. And why didn't they have that support? Because those people had already made up their mind about what was going to happen. So in this example, it gets even more interesting because this is also labeling theory in action. So not only do we have a self-fulfilling prophecy, but it's specifically about a certain label that we've assigned to this young person. And labeling is such a toxic thing that I see in my work in counseling all the time. Because what happens is that if you hear a label enough, especially from enough people, then you start to internalize it over time. And then you end up, in effect, kind of acting that label out. So my favorite example of this is in my residential work. I worked a lot with young men who were struggling with what we called problem sexual behaviors. And we specifically did not call these young people sex offenders, one, because they were often anywhere from like 12 to 16, and we knew from a development standpoint that there was a lot more going on than what meets the eye. And then two, because we're aware of what labeling can do to people. So I would work with kids all the time who had engaged in some sort of deviant sexual behavior. They had either exposed themselves in front of somebody else, or were like masturbating in a public bathroom, or maybe had even touched someone inappropriately. And often what I'd see is that the family was very concerned and had kind of started even asking me off to the side, like, oh, do you think that they're like a sex offender or they're some sort of deviant? And we'd see the teachers getting very upset, often suspending the kid from school, and I'd be able to usually chart out on a timeline kind of the trajectory of how their behavior had increased since people had started kind of seeing them in this negative light. And so they'd come in and they'd very much act that out in residential as well, and they'd continue engaging in these problematic and inappropriate sexual behaviors. But I'd see a lot of success working with them because step one would be removing the label or shifting it as much as I can. A big part of my job working with these kids was simply coming into the room and being the one person in their life who would say, hey, you know what? I think you're a cool kid. You're funny. You make me laugh. I take a very strengths-focused approach, and I'd really, I wasn't making it up. I would find things that I genuinely saw as strengths and liked about them, but I'd just really ham it up in terms of just how much and just really making it verbalized to them so that they could hear this kind of protective message of, hey, maybe, this adult thinks I'm an okay person. That's interesting. And then I would try to get the staff bought into that too. And I would explain these concepts to them so that they would do the same thing. And I would see so much benefit from that already. And if I'm really lucky, then I get the parents on board, I get the teachers on board. And even just through that, I would see a massive shift in how they would act, because it's kind of that cognitive dissonance thing again. They had this idea in their head that there is some sort of social deviant, but now they've got all these other adults in their life telling them that, oh, no, you're actually pretty cool. You're a normal kid. You've got a lot of things going for you. You've got a future ahead of you. And you can't hold those two ideas in your head forever. And our goal is to tip it over in favor of, I can make something of myself. I can be a good person. So that was a big part of it. And then the other part was also really identifying what was the root cause of the behavior to begin with. So if you recall, if you've been listening to some of the other podcasts, I've used this car repair metaphor before. So basically the idea is, if your car breaks down, do you just go into the garage and grab a hammer and just start wailing on the car? Well, if you're really upset about it, you might, but chances are, if you're actually trying to fix the car, what are you going to do first? You're going to run a diagnostic, right? You're going to check the obvious signs. Is the gas tank empty? Are the spark plugs bad? Is the battery dead? And if that doesn't yield any result, then you may even pull codes. You may take it to a mechanic to better clarify what the issue is. And only then, once you know the source of the problem, are you going to start reaching for tools and solving the problem. And so again, I see this all the time in a wide variety of issues. But going back to this example again of kids with problem sexual behaviors, people would immediately just go for the hammer and just go for the label and be like, well, we can kind of punish them out of it or just remove them from society or whatever. And that's just what needs to be done. But I'm like, well, hold up. Let's figure out why this is happening to begin with. Because again, these are kids. It's a little bit different when we get into adult territory where these things have had more time to kind of percolate and formalize and stick. And that's not really my expertise. And I'm definitely not opposed, though, to the idea of jail and other more punitive measures when it comes to that. And also when it just comes to more severe behaviors in general. But at the same time, if we're looking at the goal, especially with kids, again, these people are going to be back out on the street again. So if the solution is, well, we'll put them, in a cell and they'll learn for their time, first of all, the research doesn't really bear that out. And then even on a common sense level, kids that go in don't generally get a life sentence for that. They're going to come back out. And what are they doing the whole time they're in the system? Oftentimes just learning more negative behaviors and reinforcing behaviors, and also having their label reinforced that I am a bad person, I am a sex offender, that is what I am, and therefore I will continue to act it out. And then they go back out on the street, and guess what? Now you've got more people victimized. So especially in the case of kids, I'm much more in the camp of let's figure out why this is happening and see if we can get the behavior to change by working on that actual source. And that way, no more future victims. That's the goal. That's a much more long-standing solution that is good for this particular youth and also any potential future victims of theirs. So there's so many different reasons too why kids engage in these type of behaviors. I've seen everything from it was a reaction to their own sexual abuse trauma that had been done to them. Maybe they had been exposed to sexual behaviors early on by poor role models without really an understanding of the context and how that's supposed to play out. Sometimes it's just a simple lack of sexual education and knowledge. And sometimes it's social skills too. I can particularly remember a youth I worked with for many months, almost a year. And it was kind of a combination of factors, one of which was some trauma that they had encountered. So we did a full round of really intensive trauma therapy and really worked through what had happened to them. And that was helpful, but we had seen that the behaviors were still kind of lingering. They were happening less. He was more apologetic about them, but they were still happening. And when they were happening, they could be severe at times. And so we couldn't in good conscience have that return to the community. So I kind of went back to the drawing board and I went back to thinking about kind of the car again. What's broken down here? What is the source that I'm seeing? And what we happened to see in this case, and this was through my own observations and communicating with staff and people who were working with him in school, it seemed clear that a big piece of what was going on here was that he lacked social skills. He did not know how to really engage with other peers, but was so desperate to do so, as most young people are. They want to be engaged with and liked by their peers. And he had learned over time that the only way I can get people's attention and get them to acknowledge and play with me, or at least pay attention to me, is by doing these kind of wild sexual inappropriate things or saying really sexually explicit things, because their models in their lives had kind of ignored him, one, when he was doing things that he should be doing to do that, and so they weren't being reinforced, and then two, nobody was teaching him how to effectively engage with his peers in an appropriate way, and three, because of his initial reactions to the trauma piece that had happened and seeing that all of a sudden people were very strongly reacting to what he was doing, that got reinforced. And then it became, okay, this is what I have to do to get people's attention. It's not good attention, but as they say, bad attention's better than no attention at all. So once we had kind of developed that hypothesis, that led us down to the track of, okay, well, if that's the problem, what do we need to do here? We need to teach him some more effective social skills to replace this behavior that he has. And that's what we did. We drilled week after week things that most people take for granted and find common sense, but literally like skill cards where I broke down starting a conversation into 4 steps. And I would get him to memorize the steps, and then we'd role play the steps, and then I'd assign him to go out and practice it with staff members, and then ultimately practice it with his peers too. And if you can believe it, within a month or 2 of doing that, the behaviors on their own started to go away. And again, mind you, this was not us also, really being punitive and punishing him for the behavior. We simply recognize that this is a root issue, so we're going to give the skills that are needed. He had some clear lagging skills in that area, and we took that and we coached him through those skills. And once he learned that people would respond to him for doing the right thing, and that behavior was reinforced, it replaced the negative behavior, because it was kind of like, hey, I don't really need this anymore. I know how to get good recognition and good attention now, so I don't need to go with the bad or no attention options anymore. I have this third option that works better for me. And this youth did end up going home, and I even got a call from the caregiver, just totally shocked, because this was a youth who had been, as often was the case with the kids I worked with, they had been through multiple residential settings, and this caregiver told me that usually he'd only last like a week to a month maybe after he came home before kind of just falling back into old behaviors, but it had been multiple months. And not only was he doing okay, he was actually thriving, and there had been no reports of problems at school, which was a huge difference, because this was somebody who was having pretty much daily problems in the classroom, on the school bus, in the hallway, you name it. So once you remove the label and replace it with positive ones, and then also identify the source of the problem and replace whatever needs to be kind of rebuilt there, then you can see a lot of changes. Much more so than if you just go for that hammer and go for the punitive way of handling those things. So now shifting to kind of a broader social political way of looking at this, I also think that in this area we make a lot of assumptions of outcomes and also apply labels that in effect end up in the same way doing harm to what we say we stand for. A simple example, I have a really hard time when I see videos and even in person, people getting upset with somebody for, let's say, wearing a Make America Great Again hat, and people will shout at them and call them a Nazi. And in effect, you're applying a label. I mean, you absolutely are. You're applying a label. And the risk there, again, is that this person is going to feel, once again, disillusioned, like the previous examples that we have. They are going to feel outcast, and they may begin internalizing that label. And that's often where you do see radicalized people on the far right falling in with actual Nazi and neo-Nazi groups, because they've just started to act that out. It's almost like okay, if that's what I am, then this is what I'm going to do. And at least this group accepts me, because God knows this other group doesn't and won't even talk to me. And again, we want to be accepted. We want to feel like we're included. And if the larger group doesn't include us, then we're going to fall in with things like Nazi groups, cults, you name it. That's usually where I see that playing out. So in effect, you're potentially running an ad campaign for the opposite side when you do that. And yeah, it can feel good. It can feel kind of relieving. But ultimately, if your goal is to have fewer Nazis running the streets, then it's worth identifying the actual source of where they're coming from and your concerns about it, and having a dialogue about that, and coming up with social programs on a larger scale that help these people feel like they're being heard and their needs are being met, so that they don't fall in with those more dangerous groups. I want to throw in here, I argue that even though there are people who are really opposed to the idea, people like Jordan Peterson, if you're familiar with him, I argue that I'm really thankful we have a group of people like him now, because I see him as kind of a stopgap for those disillusioned young people especially. Because whereas we used to have those people go running off to people like Richard Spencer, now we have them running to someone like Jordan Peterson, who ultimately is telling them to look at themselves and do some self-reflection and come up with ways to become more productive, viable members of society, as opposed to turning their anger outwards towards certain groups of people. So you can disagree with me on that if you want, but I have seen a lot of value in cases where, and I've even worked with a lot of kids in the past year or so, that it comes up that they listen to Jordan Peterson. And these are definitely kids where I'm like, man, if they didn't have that, if they weren't reading that book and didn't just happen upon him on YouTube, I could definitely see this as a kid who in the past would be, watching videos from people like Richard Spencer and even worse. I remember a time when, it was like literally watching videos of Hitler and dressing up like Nazis and things like that. And now they're actively seeking to get their room in order, so to speak, and get their house in perfect order before they judge the world, to quote one of the 12 rules. But enough on that. So another big example that I've been talking a lot about with people in my personal life and online and really anywhere I can is I also see this self-fulfilling prophecy and labeling happening a lot when it comes to police altercations. So obviously police brutality and shootings are a really hot topic right now. There's definitely kind of a narrative out there in terms of, how a lot of people are viewing police and the police departments at this point. But again, I feel like this is a concerning piece of self-fulfilling prophecy playing out. If you tell your son or daughter that the police may be there to kill them, how are they going to feel about that? They're probably going to be more fearful in situations where they're dealing with the police. And going back to the podcast episode I did on dysregulation, again, when we're more fearful, when we're more stressed, we lose access to the higher levels of our brain in the neocortex that allow us to think rationally and avoid acting simply on impulse. So now, because of these repeated messages that, this police may be here to hurt me, they are in a state of fear, which means they're going to act a certain way in that interaction with the police officer, which includes them potentially making the police officer feel threatened, which is dysregulating to them. And on top of that, the police are very aware that there are a lot of people who do not like them right now and may even wish them harm. So they're walking into that situation more fearful now as well. So they're more dysregulated. They're more likely to act on impulse and therefore not necessarily do everything exactly the way that they should. And that's just a recipe for somebody to get hurt or killed. And I see this in action often when I watch videotapes of these things play out. When they play out poorly, I can almost pinpoint the moments where I'm like, okay, this person was afraid, and then they responded in their fear in this way, and that triggered the police officer to feel like they were in a life or death situation, and it's just all bad. It's all really terrible. And so I feel like that's the more damaging part of the narrative right now is, again, if our goal is to reduce police brutality and reduce the times that people are shot to death unnecessarily by police, I argue that our current route through the media and social media and just the narrative we're pushing is actually going to exacerbate the problem. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't teach our kids about police interactions and things that we should consider when we're dealing with the police and the history behind it and, the real true things that have happened that are a problem. And that we should not just allow these things to happen. Every case should be investigated. People should be taken to the full extent of the law when they did act inappropriately. I'm not advocating against any of that. I'm simply saying that the discussion needs to happen in a way that is more balanced. Because if it's just inducing fear and a generalization of an entire group, then we can expect more people to get shot and killed. I'm willing to put money behind that. And so this kind of ties into what I was saying about confirmation bias too. Let's look at this. There's lots of malpractice suits out there, right? Are all doctors quacks? No. Some doctors are not very good at their job. They get sued, and hopefully They get prosecuted to the full extent of the law. There are teachers who have sex with their students. Does this mean that all teachers are predators? No. Some teachers are just people who they've got their own issues. They should not be in a classroom. And again, they should be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. But that doesn't mean that the entire group that they come from, the entire profession, is toxic. Again, because the spotlight right now is so much on this narrative that the police are out there to hurt you, we are looking for information to confirm that bias. And therefore, the news cycle has been dominated by only the worst case scenarios of this playing out. And so now we're living in this bubble where all we hear about week after week after week is about X police officer did this thing to this person, and it's an outrage. And again, I'm not saying that we shouldn't hear about that, but it needs to be balanced out because we need to recognize that these horrible outcomes only represent a small percentage of total police interactions. If we were keeping data on every single time a police officer made contact with somebody that they had to question or speak to, I'm willing to bet that the ones that resulted in a lethal shooting or even an inappropriate use of force would be the vast minority of this. And so again, that doesn't mean that I want to downplay the bad things that are happening. When the bad things happen, they absolutely need to be brought to light and they need to be responded to accordingly with the full extent of the law, and even up to if it's a full department that's engaging in inappropriate behavior, then that needs to be dealt with swiftly and justly. But I'm just saying we need to balance that with the public understanding that there is a broad spectrum of other good things that are happening and that we're not really having a police problem. We are simply having a series of problems with specific police officers and specific departments that we're hearing about so frequently that it seems like it's a broader problem than it likely actually is. Another example of this that I feel strongly about is just in general telling a young person of color that the system is rigged against them. Now again, I want to preface this by saying, no doubt, there are things, if you're born a person of color in a lower socioeconomic status and in a poorer neighborhood and so on and so forth, there are a lot of things that could make you less privileged and therefore have a lot more stacked against you in terms of being successful. That's absolutely something worth considering and talking about and learning about, and also identifying those barriers and advocating with groups against them. No question there. However, again, bringing in this idea of labeling and particularly the self-fulfilling prophecy, the danger is that if this young person is repeatedly getting that message that the system's stacked against you, the system's stacked against you, they may over time develop the idea that, okay, the system's stacked against me, what's the point? Screw it. Forget it. Like, why even bother? And if that thought is in your head, then what are your actions going to be? And let's go all the way back to the beginning, what I said about the example of you have a test coming up. If you think that you're going to fail the test, you're less likely to study for it, which means you probably are going to fail that test. If you feel like society is stacked against you so much so that you cannot succeed, are you going to put effort in? Are you going to try? You'll probably be less likely to put that effort in. And then, therefore, you're going to be less likely to succeed. So again, I'm not saying this is a fully individualistic thing that, well, if you just put that, effort and pull yourself up from your bootstraps, then you'll be rich and famous. I'm not really saying that. I'm simply saying that society deals us all cards. And some of us get a really great hand, others get a not so great hand. But ultimately, in that card game, depending on how you play those cards means how well you're going to do in that game. And you probably won't do as well as the person who keeps pulling royal flushes when you're getting three of a kind. But hey, you can still win some games and still do some good. And there are plenty of stories where I've seen this with people who have become rich and famous, despite coming from a really disadvantaged area. But even barring that, I'm simply saying that, yeah, you may not be, the CEO millionaire that this person who was born with a trust fund is going to be, but that doesn't mean that you can't have some level of success and that you can't make something of your life. So please do not tell your kids and other kids that just the system's stacked against you and it's just rigged. It's just rigged. I mean, you can again, and you should tell them that, like, hey, these things are something you should be aware of, and historically this and that, and these are some things that have come up. And also, if you do these things, if you work on these things, you can be a successful person, and you can maybe even help with removing those barriers. So all I'm asking for, again, is balance. Give the full picture, because the most harmful, worst thing that you could do to this young person is only give them the negative side of it. Because in effect, you could potentially be the reason that this person ends up falling into all sorts of negative things that are going to increase their risk that they're going to come to harm or early death in the future. Again, look at how this ties into the ACEs study, and I see a connection there. So in sum, thoughts are a really powerful thing that can almost be magical in a way, because they really do influence not only our own behavior, but through that influences the behavior of other people. And this can even bog us down into kind of a reinforcement loop with people that we're dealing with. I've talked about this a number of times. It's harder to talk about without the visual in front of me. But if you can picture two triangles, one's upside down and the other's right side up, and they're right next to each other. So that first triangle is you. And these are both the cognitive triangle, meaning that there's a point that represents your thoughts, the next point over represents feelings, and then the third point represents your behaviors. So again, let's go back to that example of, here's a common example I hear. I talk to the young person, they're the first triangle, and they're the upside down triangle. So that first point on the bottom is their thoughts. And I say, okay, tell me about what you think about your dad. And they say, well, dad doesn't care about me. He doesn't give a crap about me, and it doesn't matter what I do. I can't really please him. And I say, okay, how's that thought make you feel? So we move over to the upper left point, and that's their feelings. And they say, well, it makes me angry. It makes me resentful. And I say, okay, and so when you're angry and resentful because of these thoughts about dad, what kind of behaviors do you have? So we move over to the upper right point, where their behaviors lie. And they say, well, I start yelling and talking back and showing defiance. Sometimes I even get physical with dad, and that's what happens. And I say, okay. And then I draw a line over from their behavior over to the top point of the right side up triangle, which is dad. And then I talk to dad, and I say, okay, dad, what kind of thoughts do you have when your son is yelling and talking back and showing defiance towards you? And he says, well, I feel like he's ungrateful, he doesn't appreciate the things I've given to him, and that he just doesn't care about all the good that I do. And I say, okay, we move down to the lower right point of his triangle, his feelings. How do you feel when you have those thoughts? Well, I feel kind of indignant and resentful and very angry about that. And I say, okay, Dad, when you feel resentful and angry towards your son, let's move over to the bottom left point. What kind of behaviors do you have? Well, I raise my voice and start talking back to him, and we get into arguments. And then I have this key point, and I've had this happen a number of times, where I draw that final arrow from his behavior back to that very first point of his son's thoughts. And I usually get this kind of, oh moment. And that oh moment is that Dad's recognizing that what is my behavior doing to my son's thoughts? And this again ties back into confirmation bias again as well. Son already thinks dad doesn't care. There's nothing I can do to please dad. Dad just doesn't like me. And now dad is yelling and shouting and arguing. And all of those behaviors reinforce his son's thoughts about him. And so now that thought is strengthened, which makes him more angry and more resentful, which makes his behaviors more extreme, which in turn makes dad's thoughts more frustrated and his feelings more so as well. And I see this all the time. It plays out. And so I tell them, you both have a role in this, but to the son, can you change your dad's thoughts about this directly? Can you reach in your dad's head and change the thoughts? No. Dad, can you reach in your son's head and change how they think about you? No. So what do? What can you control? Yourself, right? And I say it all starts with your thoughts. So I say to the son, what are some other things you could think about with your dad? When dad's yelling and dad's doing this and that, like, what are some other, one possibility is, that he just doesn't like you. What else though? And I don't challenge them on their own belief. I don't say, no, that's wrong. I just say, okay, that's one possibility. Let's make a list. Let's make a list of possibilities and kind of gray this up, give you some more options here. Well, maybe, dad has a hard job. Maybe he's just tired. And, I know I can be a pain sometimes. So maybe he's just irritated with me, or maybe he just doesn't know what to do. And I'm like, okay, when you have those thoughts, how do you feel? Well, I'm kind of annoyed, but it's not so bad. And then what do your behaviors look like? Well, I might get a little snarky with him, but I'm probably not going to yell. And maybe I'll even just give him a break. And I'm like, that's great. And what do those behaviors do for your dad's thoughts? Is dad going to feel like you're being ungrateful then? No. So in a way, we can change each other's thoughts, but only through changing our own, because that changes the whole flow of our behavior, which changes how they think about us and increases that cognitive dissonance of, you can't be dad anymore and think, oh, my son's ungrateful if he's acting nice, if he's acting in a different way. You just can't hold that thought anymore. And eventually, over time, through repetition, and it can take a while, that shifts, and the label shifts then too. And then dad acts differently. I say the same thing to dad. I'm like, what can you think, besides just that he's ungrateful, what are some other things that could go through your head about your son when he's getting frustrated? Well, I know he's been through a lot with this, and this in his childhood, and it's hard because I'm never around, and I know that I can be kind of loud and confrontational, and okay, those are all great list of thoughts. So how do you feel about those? And again, we see it change. And I can think of situations where simply illustrating this and drawing this out, I came back a week or two later and the whole dynamic of the family interactions had changed. And things were just less conflictual. And I would even have them come back and be like, oh, this is that triangle thing happening again. I'm like, yeah, that's exactly what it is. And I'd see so much great benefit and growth. And all just simply from challenging those initial thoughts. And ideally, from a preventive measure, don't implant those thoughts to begin with. So again, I just want to leave this with, how much better could our society be if we challenged our own thoughts and made sure that we weren't labeling ourselves and other people, and that we're not just assuming how things are going to play out. We're presenting ourselves with a number of options of how things may actually be, and giving ourselves a chance in doing that to play out a more constructive way of feeling and acting that is going to maximize our odds that things are going to go well. And notice I said maximize our odds. I'm not saying that they will go well, because there are plenty of other factors at play that could cause things to not go well. But you're hedging your bet, basically. You're giving yourself more opportunity for things to go well for you than if you had been simply thinking about it through this purely negative, fatalistic lens of this is just going to go badly. And I could apply this to a million other things, but I think that is enough for now. But as always, thank you for listening. Please like, subscribe, share. If you know other people that could use this message, please consider putting it up on their Facebook or Twitter or whatever. And as the two wise sages, Bill S. Preston Esquire and Ted Theodore Logan say, be excellent to each other and party on, dudes.